Good morning again. We are continuing on our Hebrews 11 study, and we're so close to the end, but we're not quite done. So I've decided that it's going to be lucky number 11. I was really tempted to either stop at 10 or go to 12, but I'm going to stop myself and we're going to say this is only going to have 11 parts to it. So we're at 10. And I'm excited today to share with you on this because, again, the Sabbath school, sometimes this stuff happens. Sometimes the Sabbath school overlaps right over and you don't even realize that that's going to happen. So that's what's happened to me a little bit today, and I think you'll see that as well. We'll go ahead and have another prayer for me since I didn't get a chance to do that, and then we'll get started. Lord, I just ask that you be with us today as the words that you've given me and the study here in Hebrews 11 touch the hearts and minds of those who are hearing. Amen. So I hope you are up for a little touch of humor today. We're going to be talking about, in Hebrews 11, flawed faith, which you might go, what are you talking about? It'll make sense as we go further along. And as I said earlier, this is number 10 in our series. But I want to bring to you a little touch of humor. This is from those of you who know Ann Landers, familiar with some of her stuff. This is from an article or the little title from her news clipping that says, "Out of the Mouth of Babes." So I hope you're in for a good little chuckle here. It's okay. It's appropriate to laugh if you need to. And so I'm going to read you this. So it says, "Dear Ann Landers, I loved the letters you printed about the misinterpreting of the Lord's Prayer. When my twin daughters were young, I taught them to say this before going to bed. As I listened outside their door, I could hear them saying, 'Give us this steak and daily bread, and forgive us our mattresses.' My husband and I always have a good laugh over this. That was 50 years ago, and the memory still remains in my heart. Miss K in New Jersey." Dear Miss K, what a charming story. I was surprised by the number of readers who had unusual interpretations of prayers. Read on for more. From San Francisco. "When I was a child, I learned this prayer as, 'Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.' I always thought that was God's real name." From St. Louis. "I worked as a preschool teacher and was next to a child who recited the Lord's Prayer as, 'Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.' I've been laughing about this one for 30 years. Grand Junction, Colorado. "When I was younger, I believed the line was, 'Lead a snot into temptation.' I thought I was praying for my little sister to get into trouble." Groton, Massachusetts. "My mother spent her early years saying, 'Hail Mary, full of grapes.'" Missoula, Montana. "My son, who was in nursery school, said, 'Our Father, who art in heaven, how'd you know my name?'" Uniontown, Ohio. "I remember thinking this prayer was, 'Give us this day our jelly bread.'" Shreveport, Louisiana. "The Lord's Prayer isn't the only thing children misinterpret. Back in 1962, my 3-year-old daughter spent a lot of time watching TV. One day, she was pretending to be an announcer. She held a bottle of ketchup to her mouth as a microphone and said, "Stay tuned for station, I've got a vacation." From California, I recall reading something years ago about the Pledge of Allegiance. Some child thought it began, "I led the pigeons to the flag." Cleveland. "When I was little, I often wondered who Richard Stans was. You know, I pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for Richard Stans." New York. "I once knew a child whose favorite Sunday school song was Gladly, the Cross-Eyed Bear." Tampa. "When my husband was 6 years old, he thought a certain prayer was, 'He suffered under a bunch of violets.' The real words were under Pontius Pilate, but at the age, he didn't know that. To this day, we still snicker in church whenever that prayer is read. I believe God loves a good sense of humor." And there's more. Lake Forest Park, Washington. "When I was a little girl, we sang a song in Sunday school about Noah. Part of the chorus was, 'And the rains came down and the floods came up.' We lived next door to a couple of charming little girls who always sang this song while playing in the garden. Their words were, 'And the rains came down and the spuds came up.'"
York area. My mother was a Sunday school teacher too. And the words were, "And lead us not into Penn Station."
Yes.
It fit.
And lead us not into Penn Station. And the last one from Ann Landers, Oak Harbor, Washington. When my older brother was very young, he always walked up to the church altar with my mom when she took the communion. On one occasion, he tugged at her sleeve and asked, "What does the priest say to you when you get the bread?" Mom said something in his ear. Imagine his shock years later when he found out that the priest doesn't say, "Be quiet until you get to your seat." I hope you got a good laugh at that. And I hope as we're looking here in Hebrews 11:32 that you will follow me in what we're saying here, that we often, not just in funny little ways, we often goof things up. And not just children. I mean, those are funny, humorous little ones. Rosemary shared a nice one about, we've all done it. I'm betting you if you were to pull family members and ask them things, I've done this with my siblings before and asked them, what did you think that this lyric in this song said? Funny interpretations abound. We're flawed humans and we do not always get things correctly. Well, let's go over to Hebrews 11:32 and let's see exactly what God does with flawed human beings. So remember that we have just come off of the last time that I preached on this. We looked at the walls of Jericho falling down. We looked at Rahab. We looked at those barriers coming down. And now we get into 32 and we start to see a whole slew of names. It's as if the author gets here and is like, oh, I could keep going on and on and on, but if I did, I'd be here for an eternity. That's basically what he says. He says, and what more shall I say? I do not have the time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Japheth, about David and Samuel and the prophets. Right? He's going, I could go on and on and on, and I could list on for you all these things that these people did, but I don't have time for that. He listed quite a few people. But I want us to take a look for a second about, well, who were these people? We don't get a chance in Hebrews 11 to know a lot about them like we do with some of the other people. We get to kind of see a little bit more, especially about Abraham. We even got a little bit more on Rahab, but we don't get much. We just get names here. We're supposed to know who these people are. So let's just take a moment to look at them. Why are these names in here? He said we could talk about these people, but we don't got time for them. What do you know these people for? I want you to think closely on this. When you think of Gideon, I've given you some things here. What do you tend to think of him for? A lot of times, the fleece, right? Right? The small amount, right? We think of that. He takes the 300 men, takes them to victory, right? That's the highlight. We're like, yes, he led out in faith. But there's also this part of him, as we were talking about with the fleece, that he's repeatedly asking God for a sign. Are you sure this is what you want me to do? He's hesitating. He's got some doubt. As the numbers are going down, he's like, God's telling him to take these men out to drink the water, and these want to drink a certain way. You're taking those, and he's like, Yeah, they kept let the men go that are. This was before that, but let the men go who are afraid to go into battle. The number keeps going down, and this man is here right now in this chapter. Right? Okay. Barak, do you guys know where he's from? Yes. Oh, Marilyn was right on it. Deborah, rest. Yes. There's a twofold on that, right? He wins a great battle, but think about this. On the flip side, he refuses to go into battle without Deborah. Even though God said, I'm going to go, Barak, go. He goes, I'm not going in without Deborah. Sounds great, but think about that. Lovely story for us women. We love to hear that story, Deborah, she goes into battle. But think about it. God said, you can go and do this. And he goes, I'm not going in without her. Who are you putting your hope in there, dude? But yet he's named. He's mentioned in here. You know where we're going with this. Okay, Samson. We usually tend to think of his flaws first. Because he was one that we get many flaws. So that one might be too easy, right? I put in my notes too many flaws to count. Too many obvious flaws to count. But there is a positive side. At the end especially.
Faithful. It doesn't
Yes.
And we are.
Yes. So even at the end, there's his big moment as he's between those pillars. His eyes have been gruesomely poked out, and he knocks over those pillars. That strength comes back. God gives it to him one last time, and everybody, the Philistines, gone. I would argue, too, that God was using him even in those flawed moments when he's taking out the enemies. He's still taking them out. Not necessarily exactly the way God was planning and leading, but he's in here. He's in the faith chapter. How did he get in here? I mean, think about this for a second. Really? Okay. All right. All right. Here's another one. This one's hard for me, and I don't know if this is actually how you pronounce his name, and it may be because I'm pronouncing it like a good old Southern name. His name is probably not Japheth, but that's what we're getting today. So that's his name. I don't know if anybody knows where he's from, but if you know this story, you're going to go, ooh. So I will tell you pieces of it. We're going to give him credit for he also won a battle. He also kept a vow, but he made a rash vow. He made a vow that the first thing he saw when he came home, he would sacrifice. And what's the first thing they saw? His daughter. Anybody else read that and go, are you kidding? What a hard story to try to wrap your mind around. And I would encourage you, because I'm not going to go deep into that, if you're listening to this and you're like, what? Go take a look at it, study the story for yourself, get an understanding for it. I don't have time to dig into the significance of it. But I just want to say, that man is in here, in this chapter. Folks, my mind is blown. Okay. David. All right, I feel a little better. I can allow David, right? If I'm allowed to judge this. I'm saying that with tongue in cheek. I'm allowed to judge this, right? David, lots of great qualities. Number one, we think of what? Man after God's own heart for so many different reasons, right? David and Goliath. David wins all these victories. He's well liked by the people. He's a pretty good ruler once he gets in there. You know, he does pretty well there. But he also makes some major screw-ups. And unfortunately for him, I suppose, but fortunate for us, God has allowed those to be preserved for us. And you know, the one that always comes to everybody's mind, what's her name, right? As soon as I say that, you already know Bathsheba. If you know the story, as soon as I say, what's the flaw, you think of that. But let's also think about the impact of that. What kind of father was he? Was he really present for those children? Was he really, really good? I mean, he had some major flaws. I feel a little better about him because the Bible says that, you know, he was a man after God's own heart. Again, tongue in cheek for a moment.
He's never afraid to ask for forgiveness.
There, Marilyn pointed out something very, very clear, right? Okay, we're making a point here. I'm being very judgmental on purpose, okay? I'm being very judgmental with these people on purpose. Marilyn's point there was, he wasn't afraid to ask for forgiveness. Clearly was not afraid to do so, and actually wrote one of the most beautiful Psalms, I think, 51, when you look at that, created me a clean heart. Like, you are never so far away. We're getting ahead of the punchline. You're never so far away. God can use us at any point. And let's take one more look here. Samuel is the last one that he mentioned. Samuel, I'm going to give him some credit too. He was a prophet in Israel, and he's a good example of somebody from a little age, right? Grows up, if you will, in the church, right? And he grows up in a situation that's not actually really that great. Eli and his sons, there's some corruption going on there, but he does really well. But he was also not perfect, and for a variety of different things. But one of the things that comes to my mind, unfortunate for him, is that when they come to go ask for a king, and God tells Samuel, "This isn't about you, Samuel. It's about me. It's not you." But they don't want Samuel's sons, right? They go, "They are not like you, Samuel. We don't want your sons." So something didn't translate over for Samuel's children there either. So in essence, if we want to be really harsh for a second, perhaps he failed as a father. But when you look at each and every one of these people, right? Are you seeing somebody that unusual to you? To me? I mean, I'm looking at these names and I'm thinking, well, If we wanted to make a list of, Brooke's highlight reels and the lowlights, we could come up with that. We could come up with that as well. And I'm sure in your own mind, you could do the same thing too. You could probably go, oh yeah, these were the victory moments. Yes. God and I got it. And then, yeah, wait for the valley if that's the case. And then there are going to be the moments where you're like, well, I totally, absolutely blew that up. That did not go well. That did not go as planned. Or maybe you don't even notice it until later, and then you're like, that was not good. I didn't even notice it at the time. And yet, we look at these names in here, any of these names that are on the list in that chapter, not just the ones that we looked at in verse 32, any of those I could have done the same thing for. We could have gone through every single one of them and found something that wasn't right. Even Joseph, who of all the characters in there doesn't have a described flaw, was human. He, for whatever reason, God decided not to spell it out for us for him. But he was human, so we can assume that he also had his highs and lows. But I want you to look further with me about verse 32 or 33 and beyond to look to see what God said about his people. So we have here's our title, Flawed people, flawed faith. So it tells us after he names all these people, David, Samuel, and the prophets. And here's what it says about them. You want to talk about a highlight reel. Who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weaknesses was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign enemies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Look at that list. Of all the things that God could have said about these people in this list, this is what he says through what? Who? Through faith. There's our key word right there. It's not because these are just flawed human beings that they're magically allowed to be in here. It says through faith did the following. And you can see some of the stories from the people that we just talked about, but you can see other hints here of other characters that we know, right? Who do we know who shut the mouths of lions? Well, the angels did that, but it's the story of Daniel, right? Or quenched the fury of the flames. We can probably think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They came out of that. Escaped the edge of the sword. That could be any number of people, honestly. Weaknesses turned to strength. We were just talking a moment about Samuel, but that could be anybody as well. Who were powerful and battle and routed enemies. Several of the men we just talked about were the victory moments. The highlight reel was these victories they had. Women who received back their dead. Think about Elisha, right? And raising that child back to life. There were other stories like that as well. And raised back to life. Like, think of all those lovely moments. This is what God is highlighting and looking at. And produced by faith, right? Kingdoms, administered justice, all the things that we went over was produced by faith. And here's the three things that I think of when I look at this. They could only do this by faith. Only faith could accomplish the things that are in this list. Right? We like to take credit for, you could look at this, we might want to take credit for some of these other things. Oh, I was all prepared for the battle and blah, blah, blah. As we looked with the story of Gideon, was he? No, he didn't want to go into battle. He didn't want to do that. But by faith, he continued step by step. The other thing I think is really important here too, is it's kind of implied, but trust produces trust. So think about that for a moment. This is kind of a hard one sometimes for people to think about, but in order to get trust from somebody, you've got to give a little bit of trust. And the more you put trust in that person, generally speaking, if it's working well, you'll get trust back, and you kind of have this cycle of trust. And so I think about that in terms of every single person that's mentioned in this chapter has an element of that, right? At some point, wherever they were at in their journey, they had to trust God at various points, and the more that they did that, the more trust they had in that. Think about somebody that you trust now. Think about how that relationship started. Did you trust them with everything right off the bat? Probably not. Not usually healthy for us to do that right off the bat. with anybody other than God, but think about our journey with God. We don't even treat him like that. We should, but we don't. We try out a little bit. We see, are they where we think they say they're going to be? When they're telling me this thing, is it true? Are they showing up for me when I think they should be showing up? And when we screw up, are we able to repair? And we build trust by that way till we get to a point where hopefully all of us have people in our lives that have that high level of trust, and you just can almost go, I don't even care. I trust that you are doing what you're saying you're going to do. Right? And hopefully that is what we're developing with God when we just go, okay, Lord, I don't understand the whole piece, but all right, I just trust. I've been through this enough. You want to talk about somebody who always where they say they're going to be when they're going to say they're going to be, and do what they're going to do when they say they're going to do. That's God in a nutshell. And here's another thought too. All these situations that we just read have an element of risk of exposure. Another word for that is vulnerability. At some point, somebody has to step off. I'm not going to do it because there's probably going to make the microphone squeak. Step off that ledge. I'm trusting that you say that there's going to be solid ground under here. So there's a level of that moment of when I say I'm going to take that step of exposure and risk, whatever that might be. The more extreme case of that would be going into a battle and being like, I hope I come out alive. But there's many of these other situations that are noted too that are maybe the risk is more about an emotional vulnerability. Okay, Lord, like, if this is going to work out or not going to work out. I mean, think about that. Why does it say women received their dead back to life? Like, think about that. Most of us in here are women today. Think about your loved ones. Think about that, what that moment would have felt like to receive back. Don't think too hard on that. It might make you cry because it makes it really sad if you really thought about it. But think about that, the side of that when you're like, right? Why? Because relationships are so important to all of us. But particularly women, we're wired a little bit more like that, to be really in tune with that. And so to receive that back again would just absolutely be amazing. So the Bible tells us this, though. This is out of Corinthians. This is from Paul's writing, that God uses the flawed. And you know some of these verses. This is 1 Corinthians 1:27. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. 2 Corinthians 12:9. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. So whose faith are we really talking about when we're talking about it was produced by faith? Are we really talking about these individuals' faith? We could argue that that is the case. You could also, which is where we're going to finish up next time, you can also argue that when we're talking about faith, what are we talking about? What do you have faith in? Who do you have faith in? Right? Whose faith are we talking about? We're talking about God. We're talking about God's faith here. And when you think about that, you're like, oh, that's a weird way. Like, it almost like you have to do some mental gymnastics. We tend to put it all on ourselves. But when God gives us faith, he gives us his faith. Now we individualize that. We go, well, my faith walk, my faith journey. I'm not going to make you try to like mental gymnastics and name that something else. I think that's still appropriate. But I want us to think about when it's talking about the weak and when it's talking about that, it's because us by ourselves are flawed. Our faith by ourselves is a flawed faith. Just by being human beings on this planet, it's flawed, as we just said. And it says here that God can use the weak, the flawed, those of us who feel insufficient, those of us who don't feel like we're enough, those of us who feel imperfect. God says, I can use that. And that is the hopeful part about this, is that that's because his faith isn't flawed. He's not flawed. So, we're going to continue on. And we're going to take a look at the rest of the verse series. I want you to think about this. So we're hitting like I said, the highlight reel is looking great. We saw the very end of 35 after women received back their dead. It says, others were tortured refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeering and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskin and goatskin, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. If I leave you right there, what just happened? Notice how it just felt so great, like, yes, victory, we're doing all these great things, people come back to life, and then we get into the next few verses, and it starts to give us, and here's all the possible, well, there's lots more than that, but here's plenty of risk and things that may happen when you decide that you're going to follow me. We're going to have victory, and sometimes victory produces lovely results like we just saw a moment ago, and sometimes people hate you for it. Sometimes people do not like you for standing up for the truth. And we're going to see more and more of that. And that doesn't mean that God isn't with you. It doesn't mean that you don't have that faith walk. What it means is that we're all going to be given, sometimes it's going to feel great, and sometimes you're going to run into troubles, and it won't be because of you're doing something wrong.
I think God is with us all the more in those afflictions, and it goes on. That's where trust comes in.
Yeah.
And these people that were sawed, you think they've suffered? I don't think so. Like Stephen's face glowed while they stoned him, and the Christians sang while they were being burned and persecuted. I think he steps in because you're only allowed to stand, but you can stand.
Yeah.
And God is right there with you. That's probably who you're seeing or who's holding you during those persecutions.
Right. So what an excellent point, right? That you're not left behind in these moments, and to expect that not every moment is going to feel like a victory in the sense of the ones that we're seeing. It can still be victorious in the sense of like these people will still stood up for their beliefs. They can still be with God ultimately, but it doesn't feel as good when you read this next section. You go, oh, okay. But a really valid point, right? You don't get to that section, and this carries through unless you've developed the trust, the relationship that says, I'm going to trust no matter what I end up with. And if you go through and you compare these, which we won't do today, if you can see we're going back and forth. Here's some good, here's some bad, here's some good, here's some bad across these two verses. We're going back and forth. But here's the thing that we really want to highlight, and we were just talking about. The point of this is, as we said, some examples, some people received life back and others were tortured to death. The point was this, that God has various paths for our lives, and there's no one certain life road, just one certain God. Let's give an example here. Acts 16, 23 to 24. This is just one of many we could look at. After they had been severely flogged, this is talking about Paul, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. When he received these orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. I mean, think about just that one story. We know the end of that. They actually are released. But it gets progressively worse as we go down that list. Stoned to death. This is a reference to Zechariah. Sawed in two. This is what we think initially, or this was the end of Isaiah, that wonderful prophet. Those of you remember studying his words. And if you haven't, I definitely encourage you to do so. One of my favorite books in the Bible. But that's the end that was given to him, and such a wonderful words that you get out of that, right? There's no guarantee here. We also get into trouble of our own making too, right? We have to feel the consequences of our own actions that we do. We're not perfect, as we just said, and we're not living in a perfect world, and we're not living in a world that even entirely understands what we're talking about here. But here is a little bit of hope. I don't want to leave you completely down the drain. Hebrews 11:38 says, after all of that, the world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and holes in the ground. And we were talking about this earlier. Well, Denzi's first ones that come to your mind when you think about this, at least me. But what's to say that the world was not worthy of them? Again, let's go back to that top list, and we were looking at David and Samuel and Samson, and we just said these were flawed human beings like you and I, and yet Hebrews can say here, the world was not worthy of them. It's not because they were so fantastic. I hate to say that. The Bible commentary says this, though. God will honor those who maintain their faith, even when the world makes it hard to be faithful. Ultimately, what we are discovering, and we're going to talk about to end this all the next time, God receives the credit for working with flawed human beings. God is the one that receives the credit for working with flawed human beings. And I want to remind you, you guys have seen these equations multiple times. Let's think about especially that one down in the corner that has faith right in the middle. When we're talking about the elements of faith, we talked about this weeks ago, months ago at this rate. Confidence, hope, assurance. Who are we putting when we're talking about those things that make a faith? Who is this confidence, assurance, hope in? Again, if we took this wrong, we could go, well, I have confidence in myself and I have hope and assurance in myself. That's not what faith, that doesn't make faith, right? The confidence, the assurance, and the hope make faith because it's in Jesus and our relationship with God. That's where we build it in. So next time you catch yourself, and hopefully it'll be more one of these humorous ones that I was reading you, where you think that God's name is Howard or Harold or whatever. And next time I hope you remember this tidbit here, that God uses flawed individuals. In fact, he loves to do so. And in our weakness, he is stronger, as it says. And from our flawed faith, he makes perfection in himself.